glad you guys all came today. I learned Friday how difficult it is to speak to an empty room. So it's good to see you. I want to introduce myself a little bit. I'm David C. Barnett, and there was a series on Netflix a few years ago that made me want to add the C everywhere I go. So I've been a small business advisor back since the 1970s. The 1990s. I was born in the 70s. I'm one of those kids who's always been interested in money and business. Even as a teenager, I can remember going into businesses and becoming frustrated when I saw things done in an inefficient way. I'd be like, hey, why don't they do it this way? They could serve more people more quickly, et cetera, right? And so this interest in business has always just driven me to want to learn more about business. I studied it in school. I got out of university and I got into a world of small business. My very first big experience in the world of small business came with the Yellow Pages. Does anyone remember the Yellow Pages? I sold Yellow Pages ads for 7 years, and it gave me an opportunity to meet the owners and managers of all kinds of small businesses that we deal with all the time. And I got an opportunity to grow professionally into the world of business advisory, and I eventually got to help people start buying and selling businesses when I entered the world of business brokerage in 2008. I actually had to check this with a calculator, but that means I've been working with people for 17 years specifically on buying and selling businesses. And through these experiences dealing with people doing these deals, I've written several books on the topic, and we're going to see some of those today as we go through these different subjects. And I maintain a YouTube channel with over 700 videos all about buying, selling, financing, and managing small and medium-sized businesses. So why on earth would a guy whose whole career is about small business be coming to talk to a FIRE conference? Well, it turns out that the wealthier you are, the higher the likelihood it is that you are in some way involved with the ownership of a business. They are super correlated. And when I got the invitation to come here, I decided to start doing some more research of my own to learn more about you, about people that are interested in FIRE. And what I discovered is that there's incredible overlap between the two communities. People that are interested in FIRE are interested in controlling their own time. They're interested in having greater wealth. They want to be responsible and have those responsible actions lead to more positive outcomes. You guys are all very disciplined, right? You're saving a huge amount of your income. You're creating investments. You're doing the things that other people won't do. It's exactly the same thing with people that are in the world of small business. How many of you own a small business? Show me your hands. Yeah, I've already met a bunch of you, and so I've seen this overlap already here in this conference. Robert Kiyosaki wrote a whole bunch of books about business and investing. This is from his second book. This is called The Cash Flow Quadrant. And Robert Kiyosaki said that money can flow into your life from one of 4 different methods. So on the left-hand side, we have E, that's for employment income. If you have a job, you have the E income. If you are self-employed, like if you're a dentist or a lawyer or something like that, then you're in the self-employed quadrant. The people on the left-hand side of this image have no leverage. If they want to earn more money, they have to work more hours. They're basically trading time for money. On the right-hand side of the quadrant, you've got the I category. That's investor. That's when you guys are buying like mutual funds and indexes and all that kind of stuff. You're in the I category because you're using money to then grow more money through either capital appreciation or dividends or interest income, et cetera. But the other group of people on the right are the business owners. They also have leverage in a different way. Instead of leveraging money specifically, business owners leverage capital in the form of equipment, trucks, machinery, inventory, and the labor of employees. So people come into work, they do work every day using those machines and equipment that the business owner provides, and they create value for the customers, and this in turn creates profit. So it's a different kind of leverage. There are incredible advantages to business ownership. I'm going to show you in a few minutes how it can be easier sometimes and faster sometimes to grow wealth through a business than through investing. And the government wants you to do this. Like the tax code of any country basically says you've got to pay tax, and that's usually on page 1. And then there are hundreds of pages of the exceptions of when you don't have to pay tax. And so a lot of those rules have to do with business because the government wants businesses because businesses create employment. and businesses pay taxes, and businesses cause things to grow, right? And so when you own your own business, you actually start to have levers of control over your taxation, because business owners choose how the money is spent inside the business, right? So we had hands go up for who's a business owner. Who has been fastidiously keeping their receipts this weekend because they are actually on a business trip? Yes, right? We heard yesterday about why you might want to pay an extra $59 for Economy Plus. Let me tell you, when you're spending before tax dollars on your travel, you go right up to the front of the plane. You travel in business class because you realize, hey, I can spend the money here and enjoy a better experience, or I can take the money out and then have to pay the taxes on it, and then I have the after-tax income. It changes the dynamic of everything. It really does. This is why, for example, business conferences are always held in beautiful places, or at Disney World, or on a Caribbean island with a nice beach, right? Because people make a legitimate business expense to go travel to a conference, and they add a couple of extra days on for their vacation, right? So these are the lifestyle enhancements that come from being a business owner. But you guys already know that, right? I mean, you know wealth comes from businesses, which is why you guys often invest in the stock of publicly traded companies. Businesses create wealth. I'm going to show you an example. Businesses are what we call an asymmetrical system. So this is an example of the leverage. So basic business, we're going to call this a shoe store. You're selling $1 million a year worth of shoes, and you have to buy those shoes from your supplier. COGS stands for cost of goods sold. So this is just the money you're giving to the wholesaler. So you sell $1 million worth of shoes, you paid $600,000 for those shoes, you end up with a gross profit of $400,000, but you have to cover your overhead. So you've got to lease your place, you got to pay your employees, you got to pay for insurance, telephone bill, all that kind of stuff. And let's say that is 250 grand, which leaves you with a profit of 150. Now, because you are hardworking, focused, and smart, you figure out a way to grow the sales, okay? You run some Facebook ads or something, and you grow the sales to 1.2 million. Now, the same proportion of that money has to go to your wholesaler because you're selling more pairs of shoes. So your cost of goods sold went up to 720, and your gross profit increased to 480. But the place you're using, the store, the utilities, the staff, that all remains the same, okay? And so what this means is that we've grown our profit to $230,000. Here's what I want you to notice. The sales went up by 20%, but the profit went up by 53%. This is what we mean by an asymmetrical system. There's leverage in the operation of business, okay? If we were going to value this business based on a 2.5x valuation multiple, which is common for these little small privately controlled companies, we would have increased the value of this business from $375,000 to $575,000 just by increasing our sales a little bit. And this is what I mean when I say that you can grow wealth and income very quickly with a business. Now, who wants to own a business? Yeah, all right, okay, I've convinced some of you. So, how do you get into business? There's a bunch of different ways you can get into business. You can start a business, right? That's something everyone can do. You can mitigate the risk of starting a business by doing some little kind of side hustle and growing it slowly over time, which is a common tactic that a lot of people will do. And there's nothing stopping any of you from going home after this weekend and just saying, I'm going to start a business. And you put up a website and you start doing something commercially and you create activity and you just start. But if you really want to hypercharge this journey, there is another opportunity. Is you can go out and you can actually buy an existing profitable business and you can become its owner and you can take advantage of all the things that the current owner has done in order to get it into that position. You can make profit on day two, but you're probably thinking to yourself, I've heard that businesses are risky, right? Yeah, businesses are risky. All kinds of investing is risky. Crossing the street is risky. Here's the question. Do you want to be in the driver's seat or do you want to be a passenger? This is the question I'm asking. And some people are perfectly happy on the bus. If you invest in something like this, who here owns any VU? Yeah, this is the Vanguard S&P 500 Index Fund. And I'm putting this on here because I want to just point out that inside of VU are publicly traded stocks. Publicly traded stocks go up or down in value based upon whether people want them or not, right? More buyers, the price goes up. More sellers, the price goes down. This is called a commodity price action. And economists tell us that when you are involved in a commodity market where everyone's buying and selling the same thing, like bushels of grain or pork bellies or any other kind of commodity, people who participate in this market are price takers. There's nothing that any of you in this room can do to make a material impact on the value of Tesla stock. It's just going to move based on the actions of all the other investors in the world, and we have to live with it. When you are in the world of small business, you actually have a greater degree of control. So this is a book that I wrote back in 2014 called Invest Local, and in this book, I create the concept of wholesale investing. The last speaker talked about making a loan to a bagel shop, okay? If you put money in a bank and buy a CD, they're going to give you a very low rate of interest, but what's the bank going to do with the money? Maybe they'll lend it to someone to buy a car. Now, the bank's going to charge a much higher interest rate, but they have to find the borrower, collect the payments, service the debt. If the person doesn't make the payments, they got to go find and repossess the car. They're doing more work. And so we can do that too. We can move from the retail level of investing to the wholesale level of investing. And that's what happens when you own your own business. You're moving from being the person who buys the publicly traded stock to the person that actually takes control and runs the business. People who will get into the area of buying businesses can often sometimes become very focused on getting the deal done. Like, how can I bandage together all the different funds that I need to make this deal happen and successfully do the deal? And they often forget about what happens the day after. In a lot of my online content, I refer to this as the day two problem. Because once you own the business, you've got to run the business, right? And I've got a whole list of there of different things that you're going to have to do once you become the owner of the business. You're going to have to make all kinds of decisions. The last bullet point there about getting into something that you actually understand, I think is critical, because knowing what the business is doing and where you want to take the business is going to be critical in determining whether or not you're going to be successful or not. In the shoe store example that I gave, if you don't know anything about retail promotion or growing business or getting new customers, it's going to be harder for you to be able to implement an improvement into one of these businesses. A lot of what you will read about business failure or business risk has to do with new businesses or new business locations. So again, people will then believe, hey, if I just buy a business, I get to avoid all of those startup risk components, and I get to jump right into something that makes money. And while it's true that buying a business is going to help you avoid some of the startup risks that people normally see when they might start something from scratch, it does not mean that you're getting into something that is risk-free. Every business faces risk every day. And because I didn't want to forget any of them, I wrote this big list. So there is market risk. Something could change in your market. Like, you could be in a town with a big industry like a mill, and the mill could close, for example, and then all of a sudden your market has all kinds of difficulty in your business. You could be the restaurant in town, and all of a sudden not as many people are coming to eat. There's something called liquidity risk. You could literally buy a business, and then there could be nobody who ever wants to buy it from you. Up here on the screen, I've got something called John Exter's inverse liquidity pyramid. John Exter was a central banker at the Federal Reserve back in the 1950s, and he created this to describe the flight of capital in times of economic panic. And so it basically shows you the relative riskiness or liquidity of different asset classes, and you can see things like treasury bills and listed stocks are towards the bottom and small businesses way up at the top, because it can be very difficult sometimes to turn a small business into cash. It's the big reason why the stock market exists, so that big companies like Coca-Cola don't face liquidity risk. You can always buy and sell the stock at any time. There's management risk. You could make poor decisions once you own your business, and you could cause it to fail through your decision making. There's customer risk. You could have too much of your sales to one particular customer, and that can create a risk. Equally, you can have supplier risk. I have been speaking lately with a lot of small business owners who are involved in some kind of industrial thing, and they've been buying a lot of steel or aluminum from people outside the US. All of a sudden, things have changed with these tariffs, which is an example of regulatory risk. If you're involved in any kind of business that has to do with government rules, and government rules are everywhere, changing those rules can create changes in your business. Fraud. There are bad people out there that are trying to steal from you. They could be your employees, they could be your customers, they could be the person who's selling you the business, right? And finally, financing risk. And financing risk is the one that most business buyers get themselves into, which is why we're going to dive more deeply into that one. So, how exactly do people put together a deal to buy a business? There's an asterisk there. And the reason why the asterisk there is it says, if you listen to popular online content on this topic, you are going to hear the story that I'm about to share with you over and over again. And I want to tell you that in this world of small business, there is a lack of transparency because business is private and business deals are private. And when business deals go wrong and there are lawyers involved, one of the very first pieces of paper that ends up coming out as part of any settlement is an anti-disparagement contract, which means that upset, annoyed people legally can't talk about it, okay? So the common deal that you will hear described is that a buyer will put down some form of down payment on a business, usually as little as possible. Sometimes a seller will be asked to finance part of the deal. A seller note is literally you saying to a seller, I don't have all the money, so I'm going to give you part of it in payments over a couple of years. That's what a seller note is. And then a ginormous bank loan. And here in the United States, there's something called an SBA 7A loan, and this is often the vehicle that people are using to buy these businesses. Now, a small seller note magnifies fraud risk, because if you were the seller in this scenario and you knew you were lying about things to do with this business, but you still had a chance to get 95% of the money on closing day, you might do the deal, even though you may not collect the last 5%, right? These deals also magnify financing risk because with a ginormous bank loan comes a ginormous payment, right? Which is going to change the way the business functions. When you go to talk to these business sellers, they're going to have a very profitable cash flowing business that's good for them, but they probably do not have the level of debt that most buyers are going to apply. So, you guys have heard of portfolios, right? Can a small business be considered an asset that fits within a portfolio? You've got risky assets, low risk assets. The whole idea is that it balances out so that you get some level of risk that you can live with. Well, highly leveraged small businesses are a very unique kind of asset because they're the only asset I can think of when they go wrong can actually eat the other assets in your portfolio. Because those loans people take on to buy small businesses are almost always personally guaranteed, which means if it goes wrong, other assets become at risk. So it changes things quite a bit. In 90% of cases, when deals are ultra leveraged, like the one I've just shown you, a small decrease in sales can usually mean that the very first thing that the new owner has to do in their business is cut their own salary. I've seen this more times than I care to imagine, okay? And the reason is because that asymmetrical function that I showed you earlier, how a small increase in revenue could be a huge increase in profits, it works in both directions. That's the nature of leverage. Leverage goes both ways. So if you have a 10 or 15% decline in sales, you could have a 40 or 50 or 60% decline in profit. And if you've committed a big chunk of that cash flow to making a bank payment, well, most people are going to keep making the bank payment as long as they can, right? While they try to figure out what to do. In these scenarios, these business buyers effectively become indentured servants to banks and to sellers. Like, I've met people who've worked for years in a business, and I'll say, like, how do you survive? And they'll say, well, my spouse has a good job. This is not the kind of thing that I wish on anyone, right? And the way that we control this is by getting a better understanding of how we should be structuring these deals. And we want to control the size and the source of the debt. So here's the good news. As FIRE practitioners, as people who save fastidiously, who have a lot of money, who have investable capital, the rules are different for you, and I'm going to share with you how wealthy people buy businesses, and it's going to be different from what you're going to see if you get into this world of online content. So, side by side, when wealthier people buy businesses, they tend to put much larger down payments, a lot more capital down. And the reason why they do this is, there's many reasons, but the reason why they do this is because they want to demonstrate to the sellers of the business that they are committed and they are going to do whatever it takes to make the business work. By demonstrating to the seller that you're serious and you're committed and you're going to do what it takes, it's far easier to convince the seller to finance a much larger chunk of the deal. And this then changes the debt profile of the leverage that we're using. It's not just the amount that you owe, it's who you owe it to and what the rules are. Because these seller notes, we can write them with whatever conditions we want. We can actually put warranties and conditions inside these seller notes that help to protect us to make sure that everything we were told about the business before we bought it actually proves to be true going into the future. It's actually like building in a guarantee or a warranty. And then if we do use debt, it's much lower, and often the debt that we use in these deals is going to be based upon the real tangible value of the collateral in the business, so that if things do go wrong, maybe you have to liquidate the equipment, but that is going to take care of the bank, and the bank debt is the worst one, because there's nothing, you can't really negotiate with them. Like you owe them, they're going to wreck you and wreck your credit profile and all that kind of stuff if you can't pay them. There's a book called The Accidental Entrepreneur by a guy named James Shanahan. And in this book, he describes how he and his family bought a small business using the high leverage method that I showed you earlier, and it almost killed them. And they managed to survive, they managed to pull it out, and they built up that business, and then they went on to buy over a dozen other companies over the next few years. And in every subsequent transaction, they did it by offering 50% down with 50% seller financing. And they did it over and over and over again, and they secured those sellers as active supportive investors in their deals, which changes the dynamic altogether in the relationship between a buyer and a seller. Many of the business buyers that I deal with are actually entrepreneurs that are established, that have done other deals before. And one of the common things that they'll say to me is they'll say, hey, when I got into business the first time, I had this really big SBA loan and I just don't want to do it again. Like they've had the sleepless nights and all the stress. So let's compare this on day 2, right? So the day after you buy the business. If you do it with this strong FIRE practitioner deal, what ends up happening is you get literally what is called a stronger balance sheet. So accountants will tell you that if you have more equity and less debt, the balance sheet is stronger. What makes it stronger? It means that if something goes wrong in the business, if you're one of these businesses suddenly affected by tariffs, for example, it means that you've got more time to figure out a plan and maneuver. Because number one, you can probably take on some debt because you have a stronger balance sheet, or you have more liquid assets in the business, more cash, etc. So it means that you've got options. Meanwhile, the person who did the high leverage deal, they've got that giant payment every month they've got to make. And so this person needs to make money every month, and that pressure can lead to panic, which leads to poor decision making and can lead to problems. The other big problem in business acquisition that people face is the problem of compulsion. There's actually a group of people called search funders. They will go and they'll raise private investment from wealthy people, and they'll build a pool of money, and they'll actually take money from that pool to pay their own salary. And they'll go looking full-time for a business to buy. And they'll typically give themselves a 2-year time frame in order to do this. And what will start to happen is because their stated goal is to buy a business, they will then feel the pressure to get a deal done. And as they start to approach the end of their 2-year window, they'll become increasingly desperate, and they'll start to make offers which may not be the best kinds of deals for them because they want to win, right? They want to make the deal. And what I want to get across to you guys is that buying the business is not actually the only way to win at business acquisition. I run a group coaching program for people that want to buy a business. And when people call me and ask me, questions about the program, about whether it's a good fit for them, a lot of them will say, what is the success rate of people in the program? And what they mean is, what percentage of your students, Dave, actually buy a business? And they're surprised when I tell them that the success rate of my program is almost 100%, because I define success in two different ways. Either you successfully buy a good, profitable, cash-flowing business that delivers what you want, or you spot all the red flags and avoid all the landmines and don't do a deal and keep your money. That is also a successful outcome, right? And so when you are a FRIAR practitioner, you actually have unlimited runway, because whatever you're doing right now to earn money and build your savings, you continue to do that while you search for the business. Every month you have more money. So you become a stronger and stronger buyer every month as you go on. You can talk with a business seller, you can talk with brokers, you can make offers, and if they say, no, we want more, you're like, oh, well, that doesn't work for me. I know you're looking for somebody who can give you more, so go look for that person, and if things change, come back. It's amazing. So many of the people I work with will engage with a seller, and they won't come to an agreement, and the buyer will back off, and 6 months later, they're talking again. Because as a buyer, the only leverage you have is your willingness to not do a deal. And so you have to be not afraid to flex that muscle, to just say, like, this is what I think I can do, and if it doesn't work, call me later if you change your mind, right? So if you do succeed in buying a successful business, if this is one of the things you decide to do, what does it mean for you? It means you get to enjoy the cash flow of a business. It means that you could sell the business later for capital appreciation. You could choose to pass this business on to your children, for example. If you have some sort of social or community goal that you want to fulfill, you could turn the business into an enterprise that fulfills that community or social goal. And most critically, what I think is the biggest thing with small businesses is it can create a cash flow which is completely uncorrelated with publicly traded markets. The stock market could go way down and people are still going to need to buy tires for their car. The stock market could go down and people are still going to want to buy wedding cakes. People in New York City are always going to want to buy bagels, right? And so you can actually build a more resilient base of wealth by adding a small business to your overall portfolio of what you're doing. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.